Hi, friends. We're going to be reading the chapters between what we read this past Sunday in worship and what we're going to read next Sunday in worship in the book of Genesis. So we read chapter 37 yesterday in worship, and we're going to pick up with chapter 38 this morning. I'm going to be reading from the New Revised Standard, or the NRSV. I want to remind you the way that chapter 37 left off, that last verse. Meanwhile, the Midianites had sold him in Egypt to Potiphar, one of Pharaoh's officials, the captain of the guard. We talked about this yesterday from the perspective of the brothers and certainly of Jacob. Joseph is gone, and they never expect to hear from him again. And so there's more to the Joseph story, which we know, even if they don't. But it's interrupted here by this brief story about Judah, one of his brothers, in chapter 38. And Joseph, it just completely interrupts the Joseph narrative, and then it picks back up in 39. And it is a wild story. And its presence here, interrupting the Joseph narrative, demonstrates the author of Genesis, the author's commitment to this head fake that Joseph's really gone, right? We had that verse at the end of 37 that gave us a little bit of hope. But now as we enter into chapter 38, we're like, well, maybe he really is gone. So anyway, it kind of heightens that, heightens the drama a little bit by being here. Now, this is a very weird story with sexual ethics that are so far beyond our experience. It's kind of hard for us to put our minds there. But there's, before we get into it, I need to tell you about a practice called levirate marriage that is given later in the law, but was practiced even prior to the law being given. And what that looked like was if a man and a woman were married and a man died without an heir, it was the responsibility of the brother of that man to marry that woman and have an heir for his deceased brother. So it's not that he would marry that woman and have his own children. Any child born to out of that relationship would belong to his dead brother. Okay. And so that was probably, the reason for that was to help stabilize families, help to make sure that women were taken care of, because a woman whose husband died without having provided a son for her would be very vulnerable. So anyway, this was the practice. As we'll see in this story, this practice was sometimes resisted by the surviving brother because it was basically requiring him to create potential competition for his own children, right? Whether it was over authority or land or just sort of inheritance, creating additional heirs for your deceased brother was not something that men got terribly excited about. And as we'll see, that's part of what creates the problems in this story of Judah and Tamar. All right, let's dive in. Chapter 38, verse 1. It happened at that time that Judah went down from his brothers and settled near a certain Adullamite whose name was Hirah. There, Judah saw the daughter of a certain Canaanite whose name was Shua. He married her and went into her. That just means that they had sex. She conceived and bore a son, and he named him Again, she conceived and bore a son whom she named Onan. Yet again, she bore a son, and she named him Shelah. She was in Shizib when she bore him. Judah took a wife for his firstborn. Her name was Tamar. But Judah's firstborn, was wicked in the sight of the Lord, and the Lord put him to death. Then Judah said to Onan, so was the firstborn. Onan is the next oldest, so this is going to be his responsibility. Then Judah said to Onan, go in to your brother's wife and perform the duty of a brother-in-law to her. Raise up offspring for your brother. But since Onan knew that the offspring would not be his, he spilled his semen on the ground whenever he went in to his brother's wife, so that he would not give offspring to his brother. What he did was displeasing in the sight of the Lord, and he put him to death also. Then Judah said to his daughter-in-law Tamar, remain a widow in your father's house until my son Shelah grows up. For he feared that he too would die, like his brothers. So Tamar went to live in her father's house. Okay, so Onan doesn't want any part of this, and so he manages to sabotage the possibility that that Tamar might become pregnant by him. And God doesn't like that either, so God strikes him down. Now, there's only one son left, and it seems that he's young enough that Judah has a little bit of plausible, cover here to say, oh, he's too young, I can't give him to you. You go back and live in your father's house, and as soon as he grows up, I'll call for you, right? But we see that he really was afraid that he was going to lose Sheila too, I guess thinking maybe Tamar was really unlucky, or maybe he thought she was murdering his sons. I don't know. But anyway, he thinks that sending Sheila to be with Tamar is going to be dangerous to him as well. And so sends her away, but we get the sense that he doesn't really have in mind to do what he says he's going to do. All right, verse 12. In course of time, the wife of Judah, Shua's daughter, died. Okay, so now Judah is a widower. When Judah's time of mourning was over, he went up to Timnah to his sheep shearers, he and his friend Hira the Adulamite. When Tamar was told, your father-in-law is going up to Timnah to shear his sheep, she put off her widow's garments, put on a veil, wrapped herself up, and sat down at the entrance to Enaim, which is on the road to Timnah. She saw that Sheila was grown up, yet she had not been given to him in marriage. Okay, so Tamar now realizes this was a sham. Judah never intended to do what he was supposed to do. And she is vulnerable because once her father dies, there will be no man to care for her. She's without a husband, she's without a son, and eventually will be without a father. And she's not really her father's problem anymore. That's a horrible thing to say about women, but that was kind of the idea, was once a daughter was married off, that was one less mouth to feed, and her dad was not supposed to be responsible for her anymore. Okay, verse 15. When Judah saw her, he thought her to be a prostitute, for she had covered her face. He went over to her at the roadside and said, "Come, let me come in to you." For he did not know that she was his daughter-in-law. She said, "What will you give me, that you may come in to me?" They're talking about payment here. He answered, "I will send you a kid from the flock." And she said, "Only if you give me a pledge until you send it." He said, "What pledge shall I give you?" She replied, "Your signet and your cord and the staff that is in your hand." So he gave them to her and went in to her, and she conceived by him. Then she got up and went away, and taking off her veil, she put on the garments of her widowhood. Okay, so Tamar has set up this, she set a trap for him, right? He doesn't know it's her. She puts herself in his path, dresses like a prostitute, only for this brief period, right? She has been in the mourning clothes like she's supposed to. She takes them off long enough to trick Judah. She puts those mourning clothes right back on afterward, okay? So we don't see this as so much like, wow, she's really chosen a bad path, or she's decided on this life of sin as a prostitute. No, this is a short-term concession that she is driven to. And you'll see why here in a moment. And she's only engaging in this immoral behavior long enough to get done what she needs to get done. Okay, so let's talk about Judah and this pledge he gives. Okay, this man is not very bright. He gives her his signet ring. That's like if in today's world, it would be like, leave me your driver's license and your social security card, right? These are just not things that you would want to hand over to someone if you were wanting to protect your own identity, right? This is just not a very bright thing to do. But anyway, Judah has handed over his signet ring, his cord, and his staff. The promise would be that he will eventually send a kid from his flock, and she will return the signet ring and the cord and the staff. It does not work out that way. Verse 20, when Judah sent the kid by his friend the Adulamite to recover the pledge from the woman, he could not find her. He asked the townspeople, "Where is the temple prostitute who was at Enaim by the wayside?" But they said, "No prostitute has been here." So he returned to Judah and said, "I have not found her." Moreover, the townspeople said, "No prostitute has been here." Judah replied, let her keep the things as her own. Otherwise, we will be laughed at. You see, I sent this kid, and you could not find her. Verse 24. About 3 months later, Judah was told, your daughter-in-law Tamar has played the whore. Moreover, she is pregnant as a result of whoredom. And Judah said, bring her out and let her be burned. Okay, so Judah is willing to kill his daughter-in-law for having violated, she belonged to his family still, right? And even though he had not kept his promise and had no intention of ever giving Sheila to her, he feels like it is still his right to have her punished for having gotten pregnant and breaking the law. Even though Judah broke his obligation by never giving Sheila to her and never intending to give Sheila to her, he has no reservations about punishing her for what appears to be her having broken her obligation to remain waiting for Sheila in her father's household. So bring her out and let her be burned. Verse 25. As she was being brought out, she sent word to her father-in-law. It was the owner of these who made me pregnant. And she said, take note, please, whose these are, the signet and the cord and the staff. Then Judah acknowledged them and said, she is more in the right than I, since I did not give her to my son Sheila. And he did not lie with her again. Okay, so this is really interesting. Does that remind you of anything? Here, look at these and tell me if you know to whom they belong. Does it remind us a little bit of the story of the brothers bringing the robe and saying, hey, Jacob, any idea? Does this happen to belong to your son? Judah was part of that, right? Bringing the robe to Jacob. And here he is forced to admit that these belongings were his, thus identifying him as the one who impregnated Tamar. And what's miraculous about this is that he is immediately convicted by this. He could have easily said, I don't know how she got those. She must be a thief too. But no, he says, it's like a gut punch for him. Like, oh, yeah, she's more righteous than I am. She did what the law required, even though I wouldn't do what the law required. She produced an heir for her deceased husband. She kept the family line going. She took matters into her own hands, and where he had failed to do what was required, she found a way to get it done. So her life is spared. They have this baby. Actually, it's babies. We'll read that here in a second. And he never lies with her again. All right. Verse 27. When the time of her delivery came, there were twins in her womb. While she was in labor, one put out a hand, and the midwife took and bound on his hand a crimson thread, saying, this one came out first. But just then he drew back his hand, and out came his brother. And she said, what a breach you have made for yourself. Therefore he was named Perez. Afterward, his brother came out with the crimson thread on his hand, and he was named Zerah. Does this remind you of anything that we've read recently? Might remind you a little bit of Jacob and Esau, this tussling between brothers in the womb. And this story is just kind of funny. The first baby puts his arm out, but then pulls it back. And so it looked like he would be the firstborn, but really he was the secondborn. Thus ends the very strange story of Judah and Tamar. This story is interesting for a lot of reasons, and there's a lot of discussion that we could have around issues of justice, issues of powerlessness and power, issues of morality. Like, does Tamar act morally here? Is she, as Judah sort of concludes, more righteous than he is? Normally we would say that prostitution is not a moral act, but here it is the mechanism that she utilizes when a woman in her time would not have had a lot of resources for seeking justice. She uses this as a way to do what's right, to do what the law requires. So is that a moral act? And then that leads us to other questions about, like, if you're working toward a greater good, can you say that the ends justify the means even when the means are immoral? So lots to think about there, lots to chew on and talk about. It's an interesting story. Anyway, lots of interesting things that we can think about and talk about around that. But its presence here in the canon, probably the reason that the story even made it into scripture, is because of this baby Perez. Because Perez is an ancestor of King David. And it's so interesting that rather than choose to obscure the fact that David came from such a messed up situation, scripture, it just puts it, it's just right here. It's right here in Genesis, plain as day. This is part of King David's history. And as Christians, this is especially interesting because this is also part of Jesus's history, because Jesus comes from the line of David, right? So in Jesus's lineage is this wild story of prostitution and of sleeping with one's father-in-law. It's all very strange. But I think it's worth thinking about how amazing it is that it's included in Scripture. What could be very embarrassing to admit that this is where your king came from or this is where the Messiah came from is right here. And in fact, if you flip over to Matthew, you'll see that the gospel writer Matthew does not shy away from this detail either. Let's see here, Matthew chapter 1. If you can flip over there real quick, let's read it together. An account of the genealogy of Jesus the Messiah, the son of David, the son of Abraham. Abraham was the father of Isaac, and Isaac the father of Jacob, and Jacob the father of Judah and his brothers, and Judah the father of Perez and Zerah by Tamar. So Matthew could have included this genealogy and still been truthful to the story, truthful to Jesus's lineage, without going out of his way to include Tamar. But he chooses to include that here. And she is one of only five, if you count Mary, four women, five if you count Mary, included in Jesus's genealogy. So Matthew goes out of his way to draw attention to Tamar, which I think is a clue to us about how at least Matthew understood the whether Tamar here is a villain or a heroine. I think Matthew would say she's a heroine for doing what the law required, even when the man who was supposed to do what the law required refused to do so. All right, so this story, again, is an interruption to the story of Joseph. Tomorrow, we'll get back into the story of Joseph, and I'll look forward to reading more with you then. Thanks.